Hello. So it got quiet in here. Thank you very much for coming back for the Upper Basin panel. With me are the governor's representatives for each of the states. I will let them introduce themselves. They need no introduction, but that's the way it goes. I have to tell you, I've been on this river since '85, and I have made some terrific friends on this river. And it's so heartwarming to see those relationships bloom. And I hope they continue to bloom among the people that you're here with here today. It's, as we know, relationships are really important. And I have, I have old friends, John and Tom from the last panel. JB is my new friend. All of these guys have been my friends for a while, and so it's fun to be a moderator and have the opportunity to try to draw these guys out of their talking points. I'm not doing a good job so far. I'm not sure I will in this panel, but we'll give it a shot. So we heard a bit about the Lower Basin proposal, and I think it's only fair that we give some time to this panel to talk about the Upper Basin proposal. I believe, Estevan, you're going to do that.
And now for the rest of the story. Good morning, everyone. I thought it appropriate, or we thought it appropriate to just kind of, and we don't have a slide or anything, but we do want to describe our alternative, the rationale for it, and provide that as kind of a backdrop for our comments going forward as well. So just because we don't have slides for this, I will say that there's some similarities to the Lower Basin proposal. And some of them are kind of really superficial, and some of them are pretty, the differences are very superficial, and some of them are just profound. But first off, our proposal, it focuses on, it prioritizes sustainable operations that align with hydrologic conditions. As opposed to the realities of our supply, which our supply keeps shrinking. It's designed to help rebuild storage and to operate within our view of the law of the river. First off, in terms of some of the similarities, in that the reduction curve that the Lower Basin put up, we've been referring to that in our discussions as kind of the Z curve, where there's a beginning ramp of reductions to get to the 1.5, then you have this, and so it's kind of a stylized Z. The shape of the curve that we both agreed to work with is very similar. Ours begins the reduction higher, but both of them acknowledge that there's a certain point above which there probably shouldn't be any reduction. As was noted, that just risks us spilling the water and letting it run downstream. Rather than eventually it'll run downstream anyway, but we want to get the use of it. Our proposal contemplates beginning reductions higher. We would, and those reductions in our case, rather than being on the basis of 7 reservoir contents, it's on the basis of 2 reservoirs, Hall and Mead. And part of the reason that we did that is that we analyzed whether there's any significant difference between those 2 perspectives and there really isn't. The other 5 reservoirs, those stay very, very constant. The movement is in those 2. So we think that looking at the content of those 2 reservoirs is robust and provides a robust way of looking at this. We begin higher, the reductions, but we go just like the lower basin. We go to a 1.5 static reduction that extends down to I don't remember the percentages right off bat, but then at a certain point where the system is getting what we feel is kind of critically low, you start ramping up the reductions, and those extend all the way to 3.9 million acre feet. So an additional 2.4 million acre feet above that 1.5 million acre foot static line. And here's a very, very profound difference between the two proposals. Our proposal has those mandatory cuts on that bottom ramp, all of the reductions, all of the mandatory reductions, versus the static proposal and the rest of them being applied to the lower basin. And I'll explain why in a few minutes. Our proposal also, and there was not a great deal of discussion about this in the lower basin, but our proposal looks at Lake Powell content on October 1st as being the basis for the releases out of Lake Powell down to the lower basin. And there's a release curve, and those there's some differences in those, but frankly, I think that we're not completely wedded to that aspect of our proposal. We anticipated that there would be some negotiation on the shape of that curve, and in fact, Reclamation kind of took some of that and adjusted the shape of that curve, and we learned that you can affect the efficacy of these alternatives by reshaping that curve. So let me just briefly describe then why, kind of the rationale of what we've done. And it starts with, well, I'll go back to the compact. If you look solely at the main stem, divided the river essentially 50-50 as between the U.S. states. 7.5 million acre feet for the upper basin, 7.5 million acre feet for the lower basin. I'm leaving Mexico out of the picture here. There's an additional 1.5 million acre feet that Mexico gets, but for the purposes of this discussion, the compact divided the main stem of the river 50-50 between the lower basin and the upper basin. With the understanding and with the reason it did that is, I think there was a recognition that the upper basin was going to develop slower than the lower basin. And we wanted to assure that there would be water left over from the rapid development in the lower basin to give us time to do what we needed to do. But in fact, that turned out to be true and kind of in spades. But in fact, hydrology has really kind of hindered our ability to develop to the full 7.5. Whereas the lower basin, given the fact that, given their growing season, given their economy and everything else, they not only used the 7.5, but as allowed by the compact, they used the parts that we didn't. They've been using it. So anyway, in our conception of the world, that 1.5 static reduction basically is a baseline reset to get the lower basin back to its 7.5. And I would challenge any of you I think physics works in the lower basin. There is evaporation and there is losses in the lower basin. So, you know, I applaud the lower basin for having agreed to take that on and make that adjustment. That's big. But then the rationale for why we say that the lower basin should take the remainder of the cuts as well is here. The other part of our reality, not only have we not been able to develop fully, we've developed up to a maximum in certain years right now of about 5.1, 5.15 or so million acre feet. And you know, it's highly likely that we in total aren't going to be able to develop much more than that just because of hydrology. But in addition to that limitation, the variable hydrology that we face, we're dependent on snowmelt and precipitation. We don't have these humongous reservoirs above us that we can release to feed our water users a steady stream of water. Every single year, maybe not the same water user, but throughout our basin, our water users are cut. Those cuts are real. They're every bit as real as something that would be imposed by operating agreement on the lower basin or by the secretary on the lower basin. It is our water users not getting water that they are entitled to. We've quantified what those hydrologic shortages are. They range, depending on hydrology, somewhere from about 600,000 to over 2 million in the analysis that we've done. I think up to 2.3 million acre feet of reductions that's imposed by hydrology off of an already lower baseline of use. The average is, we've done it 3 different ways. We've analyzed this 3 different ways. It's between 1.2 and 1.3 million of cuts every year, average. So even when the lower basin is at full supply and not having to cut a thing and getting, you know, the benefits of surplus, our water users are being shorted. Not always the same water user, but those are hydrologic, or those are shortages that are mandated by nature. So we start out from a position, if the compact gave us this much, we start out here. That's as much as we've been able to develop because of limitations on hydrology. Then from this, the cumulative shortages that are taken from us average 1.3, so even lower than that. So when our proposal says the 1.5 for the upper basin, you know, they similarly had this much water, but they've used this much, as was, you know, it's allowed by the compact and by the operating agreements. But now it's time, it's not available now. So that 1.5 gets them back to this level. Now, in most years, they're not going to have to go beyond 1.5, as was shown in the previous. But in certain other years, as things get really dire, they have to increase their cuts. And our cuts, Mother Nature is going to impose more harsh cuts on us as well. So we ask them to take an additional 2.4 million acre feet of cuts that would be mandated through the operating rules. As I've told you earlier, the range of our hydrologic cuts range up to 2.3 so far. With a drier hydrology, those are going to be bigger. So, you know, I just want to, we're in this game. We're in this game with the resources that Mother Nature has given us. We think it's an equitable way of kind of resetting things to a more equitable system that was contemplated under the compact. So let me just caveat all of this by saying I hadn't really planned to give a description of this, but I thought it appropriate, given the previous panel, for us to do that. So I may have missed some really key concepts, and I want to give my colleagues here an opportunity to you know, if there's something that I've missed, please speak up and let's talk about that. Otherwise, at least I think it gives the basis from which to start. Brendan?
Estevan, I'm not going to add anything to your description. I thought you did a good job. But I just want to address one thing. My reasoning for being on this panel was to help describe our perspectives, to help people gain empathy, for us to gain empathy. And we really need to understand that the enemy we're battling right now, it's not the Upper Basin, it's not the Lower Basin, it's hydrology. All of the rhetoric, the saber rattling, and other distractions going on right now are bullshit. It needs to stop. We need to get together. We need to work on these hard issues and hard problems, the 7 of us and our stakeholders. We need leadership, not rhetoric. And I'm here committed, telling everybody here that Wyoming is committed to meeting whenever, wherever, and how forever often we need to make this happen.
Estevan, you did an amazing job in an unexpected way describing the Upper Division States alternative. And Brandon, as usual, thank you for keeping us in line and on check. I fully support what Brandon said. All 7 of us have been in this city, yet we were not able to meet. That is a lost opportunity. That is a lost opportunity. The Upper Division states have said they will go anywhere, they will be anywhere, they will be wherever we are called to, and we will call if we need. I agree with Brandon wholeheartedly. The saber rattling is a distraction. We are focused on the task at hand. The task at hand is not all about what the shortages are. It's about living within the supply. There is no other solution but living within the supply. No other solution. I will take a moment also to acknowledge the hard work that the Lower Basin has done. Even talking about the 1.5 million acre feet, which is, thank you, Estevan, the physics analogy, but even talking about that is big. And it's overdue, and it's gonna take work, and it is difficult. But like Brandon, I sat up here to try to explain what we go through. My state engineer is here today. He cuts people off every day because the water is not there, because it's not legally available. I sat to dinner last night with one of our larger water users, and pre-compact water rights, pre-compact, dating pre-1922. Last year, or this year, somewhat normal year, they're down to a 70% percentage. This is pre-compact water. If that's happening to people that are pre-compact, what do you think is happening to the juniors within our basin? And so when you hear that what we haven't done or what we're not willing to do. We have been in the game. We've been at the table. In the Upper Basin, it's the Hunger Games. We are hungry all the time. There is never enough. There is never enough. And that's what we're asking to be acknowledged. So when we get to that lower ramp, it isn't about who takes all the cuts or who doesn't. It's about acknowledging the cuts that are happening. Acknowledging what's happening every day. Then we can be there together. And that's what we've proposed.
Thank
Did you
you.
want to run in?
I want to take just a second. I couldn't agree more with Brandon. We have this conference so that we can try to pull together, not pull apart. The enemy is not up or lower. The enemy is we don't have enough water. There are ways to figure out how to do that. We, all 7 of us, need to do a better job of coming to the table with creative ideas. I don't disagree with that at all. But at the same time, it's tough enough to negotiate with 6 other individuals than it is with 1,000. And it's my plea that we get together, that we sit down, that we be realistic about where we are and what the situation is. I'm grateful for the leadership of Reclamation, particularly Commissioner Tootin, who has spent countless hours trying to figure out how to make this more possible for negotiation. And I agree with what's been said. We need to sit down, roll up our sleeves, and go to work. Thanks.
Thank you all. So let's unpack some of your proposal a bit. Questions I hear often are, why is the Upper Basin opposed to using the initial CRSP units as part of the calculation for the river flows? Isn't that the purpose of those units? Anyone want to jump in on that?
I'm going to let Brandon chime in after me because this is one that he's obviously very passionate about. But I think when we talk about the Colorado River system as defined in the compact, it is the main stem and the tributaries. The CRSP units were not to prop up use. They were for our development. And so to look at those is an inappropriate use of those reservoirs. It doesn't mean that they don't come into play if there is an emergency type situation or if needed. However, counting them every day as part of the supply in the lower basin is it's not the supply for them. It's the supply for our future. That's why they were there, for our ability to develop.
Brandon, are you going to hop in here?
Yeah, I'd just add on to what Becky said. I agree that that is the purpose of those reservoirs, is to help us develop, and it also provides an avenue for dry periods, for protection and additional certainty for the Upper Basin. But when somebody says that we're opposed to using them, I would disagree with that. They're in our parallel activities. We don't want to just drain them. We need to be able to use them. So part of our thinking is that we provide the parameters on how and when they're used, but they are in our parallel activity.
You want to jump in? Estevan?
Yeah, because I kind of did this description of our alternative extemporaneously, I left out a couple of really key pieces, and that is the parallel activities that Brandon just talked about. So one of them is use of the water from the upper initial units in critical timeframes. You know, first to protect the infrastructure at Glen Canyon Dam, like we did in the last couple of years, but then, you know, if that water is there and things get really dire, it'll be, you know, we want to develop criteria under which it would be made available, you know, but we want that to be used only in the absolute worst and most dire situations. That's one of the, you know, we call it a DROA-like activity, because the DROA releases were what we did a couple of years ago, and those releases from the upper initial units to prop up Lake Powell. That's one of our parallel activities. The other parallel activity is we would commit to conservation activities that they're not going to yield huge amounts of water every 45 seconds or otherwise, but they're gonna yield some water like they did, like our SCPP programs did the last couple of years. I think the most recent one yielded something on the order of 68,000 acre feet. That was compensated conservation projects. As we get more familiar with how this, maybe that can be ramped up to 100,000, 200,000, I don't know. I saw Carly's presentation there, where they're modeling perhaps up to 200,000 acre feet of conservation here. Maybe we can get there, maybe we can't, I don't know. But the point is, we will conserve, and we will commit to conserve what we can conserve when there's water available, and put it in an account in Lake Powell. In the very dry years, we're probably not going to be able to conserve a darn thing. But in the wetter years, yes, we'll sock it away in a savings account, and again, set up some criteria under which, as things get really dire, that's made available. So if we go 10 good years before anything happens, we sock away 100,000 a year, or whatever the number is, make that available, and then in that 10th year, if we're getting down to that bottom curve, and we're asking the lower basin to take additional cuts, we help with that water. So those are two other elements of our alternative that I had not explained before. Sorry.
Thank you. Did you want to jump in, Jean? Good. Okay. Another piece of your proposal, and something that was mentioned on the lower basin panel, is that on an average, as I understand it, Upper Basin use about 4.5 million acre feet a year. The modeling that's being done says we would expand to 6 million acre feet a year. Tell me, what are those expansion plans?
For New Mexico, it's pretty simple. All of our apportionment is spoken for. We have entered into water rights settlements with most recently the Navajo Nation, portion of their reservoir or of their reservation in New Mexico, and basically the last of the water that we have available was awarded. I'm not sure the right word. It's recognized as being for the Navajo Nation. They're in the process right now of trying to develop the water pipelines that would allow them to take water to their people, and that's going to be our build out. Now, and I've said we've doled out all our water. We're still in conversations with the Ute Mountain Ute. They have a portion of their reservation that is, they don't have a population base right now, but we are trying to figure out how we address their water claims and so forth. And we're in negotiations with them. It will be difficult given the fact that, as I said, I think we've essentially already given away the water that we have to work with. But you know, we will be imaginative in how we come up with something. So,
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in, sure. Estevan described well the issue with regards to the tribes. There are a number of settlements in Utah where there has been water committed. That water has not been put to use. It will be put to use. There are still unsettled claims in Utah that someday will be settled sooner than later, I hope. The other thing that I think we all need to recognize and remember is the compact was put together so that there could be a future for the Upper Basin states with regard to water. Some of those uses are identified, some of them may not yet be identified, but the future of the compact was to allow for development as it occurred, when it occurred. There's no doubt at all that the Upper Division states are involved in conservation programs like all of the states are. And that, of course, is stretching the developed water supply farther than I think anyone expected it to be. I don't have any doubt when the compact was signed, there was not a lot of talk about turf removal. I don't think there was a lot of talk about smart timers. I don't think there was a lot of talk about any of those things. All of that is happening now, and the water that has been developed will stretch farther than it was ever anticipated to stretch. However, the future of the compact was to allow the Upper Division states to develop as that occurred. And that's part of what I think we need to keep in mind, is this is about our ability to continue to develop as we move forward. In dry years, 23% in Utah is already being put to use. In wet years, it's not. And so to the point that can you build an economic project on water you get every 10th or 15th or 20th year? That's probably a question we'll all have to talk through. But that's how I see, and that's why I see an interest in maintaining an ability to grow into what we believe we should be able to grow into.
Brandon or Becky?
Perfect. I think when we talk about any future development, what we know, because we live it, is that you take on the risks of the variable hydrology. When I talked about the senior water users that were taking those uncompensated mandatory cuts, any new development is subject to the hydrology. And we all know that that's incredibly variable, and we should be expecting a drier future. And so that's a risk, and I don't know many folks that will take that risk. However, tribal water, we have 2 federally recognized tribes within the state of Colorado. They have settled water rights. Those were held for them to use when they grew into them, much like the compact allowed that for us. And so we have to factor that in. We have to factor that into the equation. We cannot be allowing ourselves to live using other people's assets without acknowledging that. And so I think it's important to realize that when we talk about future development, for me specifically, a big part of that is holding space for the promises we've made.
Brandon?
Yeah, in Wyoming, we're not seeing a lot of new agricultural irrigated lands. I don't know if that's because all of the irrigable lands are already being used, or if the uncertainty of a supply doesn't provide the certainty that they need to endeavor something like that. But we are seeing municipal and industrial uses. But just as the other commissioners have said, they're limited. And so they are looking at and exploring tools. In dry hydrology, they need the certainty to keep their operations going, so they're making agreements with other water users. They're relying on conserved water that other users have already conserved, such as the city of Cheyenne. But it is the hydrology that is largely limiting the development in our state. But they're trying to make arrangements when it's needed in drought conditions to be able to still thrive and prosper. And I believe that even with the variable hydrology we have, I believe that's what the compact offered us, promised us. And I would say that if we had a Lake Mead above us, we'd probably be overusing, but we don't. So that drives our development.
Thank you very much. I want to go back to Carly's presentation about the no action alternative. And as we heard, Tom had mentioned at one point that the lower basin was saying they thought that we could be out, the upper basin could be out of compact compliance by 2027. Is Carly's no action alternative, is that the compact call, or then how do we look at this with respect to compact compliance?
I'll just say this real quickly, and others can chime in. But with regard to compact compliance, the water can be accounted for only once. So we either have to live with compact compliance, which means we have to store every drop we can so that we can meet the compact. If we don't store and we allow water to go downstream, that doesn't help us when we get in a bind with regard to our 75/10. And if there is no compact, if we're able to find a surrogate or recognize that the actions we're taking deal with a compact call, then the flexibility we have to negotiate is significantly different. And I think that's pretty straightforward. We either hoard the water, if you will, to meet the compact, or find a way that we don't have to meet the compact call so that we can then be more flexible with, as Estevan mentioned, some years there's no water at all to do things with, but on some years there are, and those are the years where we need to be very, very wise about how much we make available in reservoirs so that we can use it to satisfy the needs of the system.
Go ahead, Ren.
So I think the answer to that question is not very simple. But as far as I'm concerned, the answer has to be no. To be clear, Reclamation does not have authority to enforce the compact in Wyoming. They have no authority over our water allocation or our water use in our state. And that remains expressly within the statutes of our state. There are some, however, impacts or who interpret the Colorado River compacts as giving the Secretary in Reclamation the obligation or authority to drain Lake Powell, which would eventually create a compact compliance issue. Whether such an action would force the Upper Basin to make reductions remains to be seen. What it would probably do is force litigation if that was done outside of some sort of an agreement that we could agree to.
Thank you. Anybody else want to hop in? All right. What's the future of demand management in the Upper Basin? Estevan, you talked about, maybe we will set a goal to conserve. Who's going to pay for that, and how's that going to work?
I don't know all the answers to all of your questions, but one, I hope that there's a future for, and you know, the term demand management has for many become kind of toxic,
Yes.
and I don't fully understand that, but nevertheless, the notion of being able to conserve water, keep it in a in a pool in Powell or primarily in Powell, and then making it available in other times, that's the essence of it, right? And I absolutely hope, and you know, that's a key element of our proposal, one of the parallel activities. So we're working on making that a reality, and the provisional accounting MOU that we've entered into with the Bureau of Reclamation is kind of a step in the development of that, and we'll continue to work on that. You know, that I think that is a tool that we need to make a reality, and hopefully that we can find a way that the tribes can participate in that whole thing as well. I know that they want to. So,
Yeah. Becky, did you want to add something?
You want to?
Yeah. My short answer is yes. We have learned a lot from our system conservation pilot programs. We have learned that there's no, to use a silver buckshot, there's a BB there, maybe. We've learned a lot. There are things that we can do. There are things that will be applied as we understand how the logistics work. That conservation program, to stay away from toxic words, may look different, slightly different in each of the states, which is fine with me. There may be some uniqueness in each of the states that make conservation programs slightly different. But at the end of the day, I have no doubt at all that there will be a willingness and an opportunity and a desire to make water available to the system. Compensation is always a question, and you ask a good question, Jennifer, who pays? I think ultimately the individuals, the entities that use that water will end up paying. I can't see that the federal government has the funding to compensate into the future as they've done the last couple of years with the conservation programs. But I think ultimately, whoever is the end user of that water will end up being the one that pays the bigger bill.
Go ahead, Becky.
So I don't care what you call it, whether it's demand management, conservation, conserve pool, whatever it is. We called it out in the parallel activities that there would be conservation happening in the Upper Basin. It's what we want to do. It's what we know we have to do. It's what we do because we have to live and be resilient and survive what Mother Nature hands us. So it may not be called demand management, but whatever it's called, we know that it is not the silver bullet. It's not the single solution, and that there is no solution in the Upper Basin that's going to solve the Powell and Meade problem. I looked at the last panel and I saw 83, 2003, 2023. That's a problem. And there's not enough water to solve it without great change. And we remember there's factors in how reservoirs drop. And if more is going out than is coming in, you will have less water in that reservoir. If that's happening on a consistent basis, which it has been 8 out of the last 10 years and 8 out of the last 10 years prior to that, more water is leaving those reservoirs than what is coming in. That is the red flag. That is the warning sign. That is Mother Nature calling for action. POW indicates what is happening. POW indicates what Mother Nature is telling us. Releasing more than what comes in on a consistent basis from either of those reservoirs is going to cause dropping reservoirs. So we will do our part, we'll call it whatever we call it, and they will have a role, but we have to all increase our resiliency. We've been living with climate change in the Upper Basin. You see that with our hydrologic shortages. We all have to start.
Thank you. So I want to warn the panel, we really are going to take some time off that clock because the lower panel, I cheated the lower panel on time in my presentation. And so we'll be wrapping up here in another 5 or 10 minutes. I gave both panels, and I didn't have a chance in the lower panel to ask this, but a quote about Einstein said, "You can't solve a problem with the same mind that created it." I guess I personally don't see conservation being the be-all and end-all. It's certainly significant. But how do you feel the Upper Basin is looking at things differently? Gosh, I stumped him.
That's not hard.
What, Jennifer, let me just see if I can share a thought or two. I believe that the lower basin is more cognizant of how things operate in the upper basin than has been the case in the past. And I also believe the upper basin is more understanding of the situation in the lower basin. I don't know that that's been the case in the past. You've been around as long as any of us, Jennifer. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but in my mind, there is a significant difference in a mutual understanding of the upper, lower, vice versa basins. I think that's different than what's happened in the past. I think that helps us understand that these issues are extremely complex. We've not been in a situation where we've been negotiating with empty reservoirs. That's something new. That puts us in a different position. And I think that requires more of us to understand. I appreciate very much the technical information that we've received from our modelers, including ours as well as reclamation. I think that is a different paradigm than we've had before. We have better information than we've had in the past. So I would suggest those few things as things different than they have been in the past, and our opportunities to have better information than we've had in the past.
Estevan?
You know, this may not seem like much, but I think that our parallel activities are part of what we're doing to do something different. And the fact that it doesn't seem like much, you know, because as I've previously described, we're not going to be able to conserve large volumes in any one year, but we're willing to do that in every year where there's a possibility to try and build up an account. We're willing to use water from the Upper Basin reservoirs to support the resiliency of the system, not only Glen Canyon, but to support the Lower Basin water users in really dire times. But I would just want to remind everyone that in terms of creating this problem, we've had a minimal role in creating this problem. Again, we're capped by hydrology. We've not been able to get anywhere close to our apportionment, and every year we're shorted. So we've already been doing some of the things that are only now being considered for the rest of the basin.
Well said, Estevan, Jean. I think talking about how do we think about this differently, and coming to terms with things that we may not want to come to terms with. And one of the things we've had to come to terms with within the Upper Basin is that we may not be able to develop in all the ways that we had hoped and planned and dreamed on. But we can't plan for hopes and dreams. We have to plan what's actually there. And that involves hard choices. That involves incredibly hard choices. And when you are a headwater state and all your water comes from snowpack and follows gravity throughout the state, you don't have a lot of choice. And sometimes it sucks. And it is tough. And realizing that just may be our future, and our future may be getting worse. And we may have years that are in our recent memory, like 2021, where between the Upper Basin states, 4.5 million acre feet, it was slightly more than that in 2020, but in 2021, going down to 3.5 million acre feet. A million acre foot cut on top of hydrologic shortages in that year alone. And when we talk about proportionality or prior appropriation or however we want to find what the solution is, a little bit of perspective on that was that in the 4 Upper Basin states, 4.5 million acre feet one year, 3.5 the next, between the Colorado main stem and the tributaries in those same timeframes, California and Arizona used about that same amount of water. A million acre foot cut from each of those is proportionate. It is hard. It sucks. There was no compensation there. And asking the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, when they cut off 90% of their sprinklers, you want them to cut off one more? You want them to cut off 5 more? Out of their 100 sprinklers, 10. I think that's a hard thing, and changing that's going to happen and accepting that has been difficult.
Brent?
Yeah, from my perspective about seeing things differently, 3 years ago, I didn't know any of this. But it was a great big world to me. But I think back to some of the guidance that Pat gave me, and it's not an answer to this question, but I think it's important, that we really have to be bent on understanding the situation and the difficulties in each of our states. We have to have the empathy to understand that, and that's what's going to drive the solutions that we need to get to, is minimizing the impacts on each of us as much as we can.
Thank you, Brendan. That's what I've been thinking a lot about. When the Upper Basin is talking to Upper Basin constituencies and the Lower Basin is talking to the Lower Basin constituencies, and you each applaud for one or the other, I want to remind us that we're all in this basin together. We're down this rabbit hole together. And the only way we're going to get out is if we work together. We have incredible leaders, both in the Upper Basin and the Lower Basin. We have wonderful friends in reclamation, the tribes, the NGOs, the Caterpillars, the Mad Hatters, all of them. And we just continue to need to work together. Let's thank the panel for their comments. And I believe lunch is next.